Well, let's start and we'll get today's session underway. So, kia ora, Jinjeri, and welcome to today's webinar, Uniting the Housing Sector to Tackle Climate Change. And it's great to have you all with us today. But let me firstly acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we collectively meet on today. We at AHI, we recognise the traditional custodians' continued connection to land, water and community, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Mark Henderson and I'm the CEO of the AHI. I was just telling our panel just a bit earlier, I'm doing Movember at the moment, and I think you can probably agree fairly poorly, but I am trying. Nick Loader's laughing and I know why, but I'm getting there. But for 20 years, just if you don't know the AHI, we've got a number of non-members on the call today, which is great, but we've been focused on the professional development of our members and the industry as a whole. And today we have over 2,600 members with the Institute. So if you are a non-member and interested in joining, please visit our website at theahi.com.au. Today's discussion is a really important one, and we timed it with the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow. I can promise you we will not be talking about submarines or text messages being leaked to the media, but we wanted to make sure we have this conversation. And as you know, or as you may know, the conference, the Climate Change Conference is focusing on uniting the world to tackle climate change. And we thought it was a really good opportunity for our sector to be a leader in the conversation around climate change and tackling climate change here in Australia. So the reason why today has come about. You may not know this, but the Climate Change Conference in Glasgow is called COP26, and that's the Conference of Parties. It's the 26th annual conference being held, and it's meant to include all countries on the planet. But I think we've got a couple. Dave Adamson might talk about a couple of the countries who haven't quite made it over to Glasgow. But it's a really important time in our development as a planet. And it's good to have you with us today to have this conversation. Now, we did a poll on LinkedIn. I want to share that with you just really quickly because we're going to run this again within this group. But the poll on LinkedIn, the question was, are the risks associated with climate change taken into account by your organisation? So we had 23% of the recipients saying yes, 46% of the recipients said no, and 31% of the recipients on our LinkedIn poll said sometimes. So we just want to run the poll just now very quickly, and then I'm going to introduce you to our panel. There we go. Hopefully you can see a poll on your screen. Kelly Dunn, if you could give me a thumbs up, that would be wonderful if you could see that. You can't see. Oh, you may not be able to see it. Does anyone, Andy, can you see the poll on your screen there, mate? Thumbs up will do. Yep, brilliant. Lovely. So we're getting a few responses. And after I introduce the panel to you, I'm going to share those results with you. So another 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you for those who've been able to respond to that. So I'm going to end that poll right now. And I'll share the results with you shortly. So let me welcome our panel. It's great to have both Dave and Matthew with us. So firstly, can I welcome Professor Dave Adamson. And Dave is Compass Housing Services Group Chief Strategic Engagement Officer. He manages Compass's international development activities, Compass's consultancy services and advocacy for social housing reform. He also steers Compass's commitment to promoting and achieving the SDGs. And we're going to learn a bit more about the SDGs. He is an Emeritus Professor at the University of South Wales, UK, and Honorary Professor at the University of Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia. I don't know if Dave knows this, but Dave has also been nominated for an Outstanding Achievement Award at the forthcoming AHI Brighter Futures Award. So Dave, it's wonderful to have you with us today, and welcome.
Thank you, Mark. Good to be here.
Secondly, can I welcome the CEO of Unity Housing, Matthew Woodward. You may know Unity, you should know Unity, because it's the largest provider of social housing in South Australia. And Matthew and his team have worked closely with Dave on the creation of their climate change focused strategy. And Matthew's here today to share some of the challenges and approach Unity is taking to be a leader in this space. Matthew, welcome from sunny, beautiful South Australia.
Thank you.
Now, one of the things that we've learnt, particularly for some of us in places like Victoria and New South Wales, we've started a number of these events with just a short networking, breakout room networking opportunity. So we're just going to quickly break into breakout rooms, just so you can say good day to some of the other members of the webinar today. You can introduce yourselves. And I think it would be a really good opportunity to talk about some of the things that your organisations are doing around the SDGs and climate change more broadly. So we're just going to break up 12 to 15 minutes, just a quick chat with some of the members of the webinar today. So we're going to break up those rooms now. So you'll see a little message. If you could please press join when you see that, and we will see you back here shortly with the conversation with our panel.
But it's people are so reluctant to close it off once we get going.
Yeah. I look forward to being able to do this in person soon, properly. Yeah. So I think we're got everyone coming back now. Kel, would you think?
Yeah.
Let's make sure that two people of interest are here, Matthew and David. I could see both of them back in the room. So our panel's here. So I think we might kick back on now. So thanks to everyone. We've been running these virtual networking for a little bit now, so we've been getting some good feedback. So I hope you enjoyed catching up with some of your colleagues and peers in the sector. Now I'm just going to share with you the results for those of you who have participated in the poll. For those who've just come just a little bit later, we've just run a poll to talk about the knowledge of the Sustainable Development Goals. So let me just share the results, and then we're going to go straight into our discussion with the panel. So I hope you guys can see that on your screen. Andy Dennis is my cue. Thumbs up, Andy. You can see that, I hope. Yes, thank you. Brilliant. So there's the result. How would you describe your knowledge of the Sustainable Development Goals? So we do have some experts right through to no knowledge at all. And probably for David and Matthew, probably aligns a little bit to our LinkedIn poll responses when we talked about organisational risk and understanding of the SDGs and how that works. So we might talk about that a little bit later. Now, just finally, before I throw to the first question and through to our panel, we want as much interaction with both David and Matthew as we possibly can. If you want to ask questions of either gentleman, please put the questions in the chat, or use the raise the hand function on Zoom if you want to ask a question out loud with your camera on and using your mic. So we're happy to take that as well. So please do that. We encourage as many questions as possible. David Adamson, my first question is to you, if that's okay. I just want to open up with, could you tell us what the Sustainable Development Goals are and where they've come from? You're just on mute, Dave.
Didn't realise I'd been muted. Got it.
No, you're right.
Yeah, and just to start with that poll result, 61% having some knowledge. I think if we'd asked that even 2 years ago, that figure would have been a lot less substantial than that, I think.
Yeah.
So the SDGs were agreed by the United Nations in 2015. I think it was September, effective 1st of January 2016. 17 goals in all. I'm sure most of you would have seen the very colourful icons that represent those goals. Very simple, clear message in each icon, like no poverty, zero hunger, climate mitigation, climate action. Very simple, straightforward messages. But of course, lying behind those are a whole bunch of targets. And I think at the last count, when I looked, it was 231 indicators that measure those goals. And basically, they're centrally concerned with addressing social equity issues like poverty, like hunger, like gender equality, and of course then climate issues like life on land, life in underwater, and climate mitigation. and they build on the Millennium Development Goals, which have been relatively successful. I think the general opinion is the SDGs have been less successful to date, but of course, still 9 years to run, and the decade of action for the SDGs declared by the United Nations. So, there's very much that sense of urgency that we've got this next 9-10 years to really home in on them and start to deliver them in their entirety.
Yeah, and Dave, just as a very interested kind of observer to what you're been seeing from afar in Glasgow, what's your sense for progress when you've read and participated in some of those events?
I've got a personal motto, which is relentless optimism. It does occasionally let me down, and I must admit the last week I found quite depressing, and I think Glasgow has been a big disappointment. Clearly, 2 or 3 critical nations, Russia and China, not at the table, and commitments from other countries almost being denied the next day that they were committed to, in the example of Indonesia on deforestation. So overall, bit of a damp squib, I think, and but the optimism, I think, comes from the changing public perceptions, and that we will begin to exert political pressures on our multiple governments in time, and a new generation of young people we've seen through the climate action, climate Fridays, deeply concerned with their futures, and I think impressing on their parents and their grandparents. And I think we are seeing quite a seismic political shift on climate change, particularly here in Australia. I think the public is now a long way ahead of government, and certainly the business community is a long way ahead of government as well.
Yeah, so it's a good segue into my next question. So we talk about what governments can do. So maybe what I'm hearing is they're dragging their feet a little bit, and we need a little bit more kind of reinforcement from the community that this is something really important, because that could turn into votes. So so how do they connect the goals from a government perspective back into our organisations? How do they kind of connect?
Well, one of the difficulties, I think, for organisations in implementing the goals is that many of the targets are kind of set for national government. So what we have to do as organisations is kind of translate those into how we contribute to some of those objectives. And I think when we're working with Matthew reviewing some of Unity's actions, a lot of housing organisations already hit a lot of the social objectives of the SDGs. And we contribute, in a relatively small way to the achievement of those national targets. And I think it's how we recognise what we do as organisations, and then how we plan to do more and impact more on the objectives. Also recognising which objectives we can do something towards, and which we can't, of course. Which some of them we can't. Excuse me, it's getting a call. So I think that's that's quite critical to recognise that we are able, particularly as housing organisations, to do quite a lot, but that we can't hit all 17 goals square on. There will be 5 or 6 that are very core for our activities.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about what we can do from an individual and from our own personal lives. But Matthew, I just want to throw to you, if I may. You've seen, you probably, you may not admit this as such, but you're being a leader in the field as far as connecting with the SDGs and taking a really important stance as far as what you do as an organisation. What was the motivator, I suppose, for you to go and work with Dave to head Unity down this path?
Look, I mean, I guess it's personally, I've had a long-standing interest in these issues, and of course, stretching back to the Brundtland Report in 1987 and Our Common Future, many of us, Dave included, took notice at that point in time. So I think it needs to be said, these are not new issues, and there's many of us who've been, tracking these issues for a long time, and what we've seen is the increasing urgency, I guess, of the need to actually start to respond to these issues. You know, we can all think back to a time not that long ago when, you know, the issue of, you know, climate change, you know, was seen really as a greenie issue, a fringe issue, not something to be taken seriously, on the fringe of politics. But since the Brundtland report, it's been introduced into mainstream politics, the triple bottom line reporting, etc. Business has been taking note, as we say, over time. So I guess that's the genesis of our organisation's interest, has been, you know, through my interest in that. But I'd say over the last, you know, 5 to 10 years, as we've become more engaged, I'd want to really acknowledge the leadership that's been provided in this space through Compass, and in particular through the CEO, Greg Budworth. Don't know if you're out there, Greg, but I'll never forget seeing you on the stage at the UN for Habitat 3. You know, a very bold move and well delivered. But so, I mean, there's been leadership there. So like, as we've sought to actually engage as an organisation in this area, we've been able to, in a sense, be in the slipstream of Compass. So I just want to acknowledge that straight up. So for us, it's a resource issue, as it is for a lot of organisations. You know, our core business is, you know, as we see it, you know, the delivery of property and tenancy management services and affordable housing to low-income people. So your capacity to, I guess, expand your interpretation of your business, and how you might justify, you know, pushing resources into doing more in this space, it has always been a challenge. But as these issues present increasingly as core issues for us all to be concerned about, the risk that they pose to our organisations and our business, you know, Unity's begun to focus more in on them. And I guess there are two things to say in that. I mean, you know, one is we're all aware of the need to audit our properties around bushfire risk, given, you know, over the last 5 or 6 years. So without recognising it, as Dave says, we're beginning to really step strongly into this space. Just the risk, the increasing risk that is presented by these issues is becoming front and centre for us in an operational sense. And of course, then there's a growing awareness at board level, and the Institute of Company Directors has been quite loud about this for some years now, that, you know, the governance responsibilities that sit across our boards to actually acknowledge this is a risk. This is a risk to boards increasingly. You know, the whole, you know, basic, which business is aware of and business is responding to, that there's an acknowledged risk. If boards are seen not to be responding appropriately, then they're culpable. So there's across the whole range of areas in that space. So you can see there's been a rising interest. So that essentially has been sort of our journey to the point where we've looked at, well, how do we become more focused? And I guess in doing that, we've recognised that a lot of what we're doing in our work with Dave, particularly, a lot of what we're doing around the SDGs, it's core, it's part of our business for all of us. We're all actually already working and delivering on a whole range of the Sustainable Development Goals, you know, across the no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, you know, just the first three. You can think back into your own business and you can think about how you're actually delivering and impacting for individuals, your tenants in those areas. So our concern is to become more proactive, and particularly to move towards a more transparent approach to what we do in the SDG area, so that we can monitor and ultimately begin to measure what the impact we're having is, and set ourselves some stretch targets and some goals. 2030, where will we be in terms of our carbon footprint as an organisation by 2030? We need to be structured and pragmatic about how we get, you know, setting a realistic target, and then stepping stones along the way. And so that's the sort of work we've been doing, led by Dave and our executive and our staff. are involved in that process. There's, of course, an educative process in there as well, bringing people with you and building the SDGs really back into the fabric of the organisation. A lot of the SDGs won't be delivered through a specifically SDG strategy. If you think about our audits of properties, our building specs, the materials we use, where we build, you know, our development program will deal with a lot of those. Tenant engagement and working around food security and working with food bank and so forth. A lot of that will be delivered through our tenant engagement strategy. But I guess we do need a unifying strategy across the top to really pull these things together and articulate what and why we're stepping into these areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And clearly we need leadership. And I've just got a message on chat there. So Greg is on the call, Matthew. So I think, you know, what we need is real leadership with you, Unity, with Compass and experts in the field, people like Dave. Dave, I'm going to cross to you about a question on the social justice and the climate justice angle, because we've just talked about that briefly. But Matthew, just a follow-up question to you. We've just talked about in our opening poll, the poll that we ran on LinkedIn. And for those who've just come late, let me just reiterate. The question was, are the risks associated with climate change taken into account by your organisation? Now, Matthew, we had 46% of the respondents to that poll say their organisation doesn't. If you were put into the boardroom of those organisations, and let's assume that that's true, what's your opening message to boards and chairs of boards and CEOs around what they should be doing and why it's important?
Well, I guess my opening message would be, in a sense, this is not a discretionary issue. Yes, it's not one you can choose to be impacted by or respond to. You don't have choice. You are already caught in this frame, and you need to urgently structure and articulate your responses to a whole range of challenges. And I'd be surprised, quite frankly, if a lot of those who think that they're not responding, I would guess that there would be aspects of their business which are responding.
Yeah. Thank you. And we just got a comment through from Jess saying good points from both you. And the point is the partners we mentioned, e.g. Food Bank, will benefit from our coordinated support of their planning, response and scaling strategy. Absolutely good point made. Thank you, Jess. So Dave, just back to you. So we've been talking about the SDGs promoting social and climate justice. Can you step us through that and give us a bit of explanation of what they actually mean?
Yeah, sure. I think in the housing sector we have a good sense of what social justice is. You know, it's about equity and equitable outcomes, often for marginalised populations that don't do well in the health, the housing, the employment, the education fields. And social justice is about raising achievements in all those policy domains. And I think we're probably well versed in that in the social housing sector and the community housing sector. Climate justice is more about that the impact of climate change will hit those communities harder than other communities. And in our little networking conversation, we explored that populations with already a high health burden, living in perhaps poor housing, no air conditioning, distance from services, a whole range of factors mean that the impact on those communities will be higher. And that therefore it's incumbent on us all to take climate mitigation action to create a climate justice for those populations. And of course, poorer nations will suffer harder as well. Our Pacific neighbours are at the very sharp end of climate change. And 2 years ago, I stood in a small settlement in Fiji, literally on the beach, and the seawater was already coming up through the groundwater and causing problems in that community. So this isn't 10 years time, it's now. And climate justice is about it's our collective responsibility to tackle that on behalf of those who will suffer most.
Yeah. And what's the first step in that process? So if we bring it down to an individual level, say, families, people in their homes and communities. So I mean, what can we do as individuals towards those goals?
Well, I had a bit of a shock this week. My bank has started reporting my carbon footprint to me based on my purchases.
Right.
And I'm heading for 27 metric tons of carbon dioxide this year. And I'm pretty conservative on these things. I do take actions. So, previous calculations I've seen 18 to 20 average households, tons per year of carbon dioxide produced. So simple things are, turn your thermostat down, draft-proof your home for winter, insulate your loft. Those are the relatively simple things. Bigger things, of course, install solar, heat pumps for hot water. If you can't do solar, next time you buy a vehicle, make sure it's an electrical vehicle. Those are big changes, and not everyone can make those. But these are the lifestyle consumption things that we will all be doing in time. You won't be able to buy a non-electric vehicle at some point in the future because manufacturers are exiting that market rapidly. So from the small to the big personal actions we can take, we can all contribute collectively. There's an old saying of the wobbly movement in America that it only takes drops of water to turn a mill. Because there are so many drops of water. So collectively, if we take that action in our own lives, then it's got a big impact down the line.
And Dave, what are you seeing happening in, say, the schools environment and the educational environment? What are our kids being taught as far as their role in the climate change strategy and approach, and what are they communicating back at home? Now, I've got 4 kids. I can tell you what mine tell me a lot. The good and the bad, but what's the education that's happening at the individual level within schools around climate change?
There is a global movement called Education for Sustainable Development, and there's huge curriculum suggestions and resources that teachers can draw on.
Yeah.
And some countries actually enshrine that in the national curriculum. Less so in Australia. It's done very much, I think, to individual schools. But I think what we also underestimate for young people, of course, is the power of social media and where they also get their information from other than from us as families and from schools as their main learning source. And I think the growth of the school strike, the Friday strike process globally, almost instantly, demonstrates that. So whether it's in the schools or whether in our families or whether through their peer groups, young people are learning about climate change. They know what the future holds for them, and they are, demonstrating concern and taking action. Yeah,
absolutely. It's very positive. Matt, can I just go back to you? Just a question from an organisational perspective. When we talk about leadership, which we've just touched on, can we talk about governance and the role of the board? And maybe if you're able to share your own experience with working with your board on some of these strategies.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm fortunate in having a board that are fully cognizant of these issues. They've they're all Institute Company Directors members, and so they've read the material that's come through from Institute Company Directors, and it's really I guess their concern is twofold. One is, as it was on with our boards, risk always gets their juices flowing, but they're recognizing that it's a responsibility that they have as part of their governance role in the organization to ensure that these issues are acknowledged and that we put our best foot forward as an organization to try and manage them in that sense. So there's an active interest at that level. They're also interested, obviously, in terms of our mission as an organization at the end of the day is to deliver best possible services and to our tenants, and we have a duty of care and a responsibility in that space.
Yep.
And it's really back to Dave's point, that it's the least well off in our communities who are most impacted by these issues in the long run. There are fewest options for them in terms of, control over the built form that they live in and so forth. So that responsibility falls to us, and we feel that quite keenly. So, whether it be through our built form is obviously a key area of responsiveness for us. There's huge risk associated with the location of that built form. And we've undertaken an active audit of our housing to identify those properties that are at risk, whether it be bushfire or particularly in terms of new development, low-lying areas and flooding risk. So looking to, make decisions about our maintenance, our refurbishment, our repurposing of that stock, looking into areas like the introduction and retrofitting of solar, heat pumps, reverse cycle air conditioning and so forth. We're being very active in that space and looking for opportunities to work into that space. So, it's in terms of board, it's risk, it's governance responsibilities, and then it's financial in terms of, managing our asset management strategies and our refurbishment maintenance strategies. How and where does the money get put? Of course, there's limited resources, so you have to prioritize where it will and won't go. Increasingly, the emphasis and the priority is moving towards the quality of the product in terms of meeting climate impact SDGs and so forth. Moving from not just considering the location of our properties in terms of access to transport and services and so forth, which we all do and we've always done. It's adding to that list now a range of other factors that we need to be considering at the same time. So it really is pulling some levers around the business model, and board central to supporting us in doing that.
Absolutely. And let me just ask a follow-up, and then I'm going to go to a question that we've got from Greg, Dave, that I might pose to you. But let me just ask a follow-up, Matthew, if I may. So, the board agree with the approach. They see the advice that's coming out of the AICD and others, and then you've been tasked to make it real, put it into the operations of Unity and your organisation, which is clearly going to take some kind of change management activity. I wonder if you could share how you've started or looking to start the operationalizing of some of those initiatives in the business.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's timely. We're going through the number of initiatives as always in an organisation, and so looking to try and, I guess, coordinate those into an overriding change management process. So I guess we've been actually doing some work at the executive level, particularly just in the last week or two, really trying to step back and look at our change management process. So we're not implementing a whole lot of ad hoc initiatives across the organisation, which often have overlap. As I said before, a number of the SDGs are delivered through existing programs and strategies, or into the future will be delivered through, our building specifications and our asset strategy, or our tenant engagement strategy, or our reconciliation action plan, which all stand alone as initiatives. But I guess it's stepping back, and in answer to your question in terms of change management, I guess it's coordinating that in a way that, doesn't overwhelm the organisation and our staff, that brings people with us, and is realistic about what we can achieve with the resources and over the next time frame. Obviously, this is a journey, and it will be over a period of time. So actually framing it in that context.
And it sounds like it'll just be part of normal operations probably very shortly on. So let me go to the question Greg poses, David, and just for those who can't see it, the question asked was Greg would be interested to know the latest predictions on the runaway temperature rising if we do pass the 2% benchmark. Is it still being seen as beyond human control to bring it back past circa 2%, David?
Yeah, the Paris Agreement set an objective to keep temperature rises above pre-industrial levels to 2 degrees centigrade. with an aspiration to keep it at 1.5. The general pre-COP26 feeling was that we were not going to achieve 1.5, and the achievement of 2 was very much down to the outcomes of COP26. The only estimate that's come out from that process so far, don't forget negotiations are still ongoing this week, is that the commitments made by the leaders last week would keep temperature rise to 1.9. Now, the significance of that is that the Intergovernmental Planet for Climate Change, the IPCC, which you would have all seen that report that came out in September and warned that we were at a red line crisis point, they make predictions called representation concentration pathways, and they have various scenarios. And the one that's currently kind of managing expectations is a representation pathway of 4.5, which is their measurement. A 2-degree rise would take it to the next level of 6. And of course, each stage, and the top prediction is 8. Now, that's not temperature, this is just a scale they use. If we got to a 6, then we get increased heat events, we get more drought, we get more extreme weather events, more cyclones, everything. It's really, we enter a stage of considerable unpredictability where we move. And then there's this, of course, this concept of tipping points. The higher temperature we get, the more naturally sequestrated carbon gets released. So the more forests that burn, the tundra melts, seawater level rise. It becomes an unpredictable scenario of how rapidly things can escalate.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've just got, thank you, Sharon. Sharon Kelly's just offered a good resource, Dr. Josh Byrne. You across Josh Byrne's work, Dave, yourself?
I've certainly read some of it. Yeah, it's it's very good advice. Someone's also posted the yourhome.gov site, which is also very useful, particularly in terms of local action that you can take in your own household. So there are lots of resources in there. I think some are pointed to in the article on your website.
Yeah, brilliant, fantastic. Now we've got a question from Ellis at Bridge Housing. Ellis, over to you whenever you're ready.
Hi, thank you. I guess this might be kind of a bit of a twofold question. I was just wondering if you could talk through, I guess, your experience in implementing some best practice initiatives in actually reducing the sort of climate impact. And I guess that probably that sits underneath that is actually around impact measurement and how we actually measure, the impact of our operations in terms of their climate impact. I've just seen that there's so much out there and there's so many different ways of measuring impact. So I'd just be really interested to hear from you both your reflections on impact measurement and then best practice.
Yeah, well done. Thank you, Alice. A great question. Dave, do you want to tackle that one first?
Yeah, I think impact measurement is critical. It's part of the way the SDGs report through to the United Nations. Each country does a voluntary national report. But internally within our own organizations, when we've translated those targets to specific actions, and this is part of what Matthew and I have done with his executive team, we've established specific unity targets, and all of those are measurable. Some of them within existing processes that Unity implement, others require some new data tracking and measurement. But it's probably slightly different for every organization. But I think we do have to measure impact, and really the measurements you use fall out of the actions you decide to take. So in Unity's case, we've established a number of actions, and we've developed how we will measure those and what the time scale and intervals of that measurement is.
Brilliant. Matthew, do you want to post any comments on that?
Yeah. I mean, it really, as Dave's just talked through, and if you I quoted a couple of them before, but if you think about it, it's in terms of no poverty, it's debt levels and managing those better with our tenants. It's zero hunger, actively involving tenants in food production, etc. Quality education, it's our staff and involving them in upskilling and educative processes. Gender equality, it's the overall portfolio that we're targeting towards DV. It's the proportion of middle and senior management roles occupied by women within the organisation. So we've set across all of those, and affordable energy, it's the proportion of energy derived across our portfolio from renewable sources, etc. So, we've set targets, and there's been much debate at executive about setting ourselves realistic targets, aspirational targets, but I guess achievable targets. And we've had to rein Dave in a few times on that. That's too hard, Dave. We can't do it. But it's getting a balance between the two and being realistic about it. And then, of course, there's got to be the action plans that are developed from that. And we've set targets that are at, going through to 2030. So we've set 3-year targets. So it's progressive. So we have got some clear targets we've set ourselves, and we can then measure those. Yeah, measurement is the real challenge. Some of those, of course, we already measure in terms of, whether it be debt levels and education and training and so forth. So we can capture that within our existing mechanisms. Others are more difficult in terms of social impact measurement. And we've used Australian Value Bank to date to try and get a stake in the ground. We're now looking at other mechanisms. Social Suite, for instance, is one that we're looking at. Dave, I know you've got some experience at Compass in that space. You could talk in more detail about that, but they're not to be taken on lightly. They've a big resource commitment, and you really need to develop expertise. And again, you're loading that on top of the business you do already and the challenges that sit in there. And measuring carbon footprint, that's something we're walking tentatively towards. But again, Dave can speak in more detail about there are independent operators who can do that on your behalf. So we're beginning to explore that. But I guess the setting of the targets is the real challenge in the first instance, to get something that's stretch targets that are meaningful, but are realistic and measurable.
Alice, does that cover your question? Did you want to pose a follow-up?
I think it's really interesting, and thanks for those reflections. I guess I was hoping that you'd tell me exactly what we need to do and how we measure our climate impact, and just go to this particular person and this is what we need to do. And I think it's interesting because I think as a sector we have done quite a bit of work in that social space, but feeling like the sustainability space is quite new. And I'd be really interested, particularly in terms of retrofitting stock, if there's any, exactly how do you sort of engage with tenants around around these sort of measures to reduce the carbon impact of the footprint, and ultimately to reduce their energy consumption.
Yeah, perhaps if I can just comment a little bit further there. We've got, we called it, when we were setting it up, a tenant tips booklet, which neatly summarizes what it is. And it's about, cooking economically, water saving, energy saving. So advice, very simple, straightforward advice that if the tenants follow, they can reduce not just their carbon footprint, but the costs to them. So it's also an anti-poverty strategy as well, I think is worth mentioning. We install community gardening opportunities. We use something called VeggiePod, which is a very flexible and adaptable pod that can be planted very simply and straightforwardly. So there's lots to do, I think, in the community participation front with our tenants and the education of tenants in these things. But I think then again, in terms of measurement, it depends. I think every organization will identify different SDGs, will align some existing actions that they already take, will develop new actions that they feel feasible for them, and then the measurements come out of that. So it's that exercise really, which, the process with Matthew was an audit of what's already done, conversations about what the aspirations were, developing then realistic targets and objectives, and then working out what the measurements are. And I think every organization will be different and will prioritize different SDGs. So, you know, working with Matthew's team, I initially came up with what I thought were the priority SDGs, but then through conversation and discussion and some workshopping of that, we actually changed some of those, and priority ones became priority twos, and priority twos became priority ones. You know, these are the kind of things that you have to go through a reflective exercise to work all that out, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, no, good. And thank you, Ellis, for those questions. They are fantastic. Just got a comment from Jess on the chat saying that surely we have colleagues out there with monitoring and evaluation expertise. Let's set up a practice group. So I think that's a really good idea. And I think Kelly Dunn from the AHI has just said that's a great idea. I think that means it's going to happen for you, Jess. So look out for that. We do have a couple of questions coming through, gents, on cost, and we've been talking a little bit about cost. I'm sure cost is high on the priority list of reviewing the strategic approach. So Peter Clayfield asked a really good question. What is the current dollar cost per property of measuring carbon footprint? Maybe approximately, if we don't have a specific.
Oh, I'm not sure that you would actually cost it per property in a sense. Compass has been measuring its carbon footprint. I think we're probably in about the 6th year now, and we have an external agency independently verify our carbon footprint. I couldn't break that down in a cost per property immediately. I could do that retrospectively, I think, but it wouldn't be significant.
Yep. Okay. Fantastic. And Matthew, would you concur on that?
Yeah. Yep. I would. I don't have that information.
Yeah.
Defer to Dave on that.
Absolutely. And could we just talk about costs more broadly then, because obviously organisations will be going down this line and probably more quicker than maybe some of them probably first thought. So what are the cost implications that they need to be aware of, Dave, as they kind of approach the implementation of some of these SDGs, or all of them?
Again, I think it depends on which SDGs you prioritise and what actions you align yourselves with. So if we take, for example, the community participation elements, then clearly you need some staff to do that work. Compass has a team of 8 community participation officers that do this, but also, you know, much wider social interventions and attempts to improve social outcomes for tenants. So that's part of what we do, and we did that independently of our SDG alignment, but have now aligned that with the SDGs. But of course, I would balance those costs with also some of the returns, which are, you know, less antisocial behaviour, hopefully reduced debt, more cohesive communities. So there are some less tangible outcomes that come from that expenditure. In terms of the climate mitigation impacts, I would say almost without exception, they would end up as cost savings to the organisation. You know, if you think of reducing energy consumption or switching to a renewable supplier, changes to your fleet operation to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, particularly electrification of your fleet, all those ultimately may have an upfront cost, but would have a longer term saving likely. So overall, I suspect carefully managed, it could be cost neutral.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. No, that's good. And Matthew, yeah.
I was just going to say, I mean, of course, there's the low-hanging fruit, which is what you already do. So in the audit, we identified a range of activities that we already do. So there's no additional cost impost in them, obviously, and you could recognise that already you're funding activities which are delivering on the SDGs or working towards it. There's also, apart from, in addition to Dave outlined, I mean, there's also, of course, those areas which are a cost to the organisation but a benefit to the tenant. So particularly in the solar, installations and photovoltaic, historically it's been homeowners who've been eligible for grants and subsidies to be able to actually put infrastructure onto their own dwellings, and renters have not been subsidised in the same way, and yet it's the household that reaps the benefits of lower electricity costs, etc. So there's an overlap there in terms of, I guess, our investment in outcomes for our tenants as well, and the savings that are there for our tenants, but involve some additional infrastructure cost up front by us. But then that's consistent with our mission as organisations. So it becomes a question of your cash flow, your budget, and your capacity.
Yeah. Matthew, can I just ask I suppose more of an operational question? So in the development of your strategy, you know what your end goal will look like, particularly, but how do you measure now your progress? What are the lead indicators you look at to know that Unity's on track towards that end proposition? What do you do there from a KPI perspective?
Oh, look, I mean, we're still working through that. I mean, that's, we're on the journey. But as I said before, some of them, when we looked at the specific actions and the metrics we're going to actually use to identify whether we're making progress or what our targets are, some of those are already captured through our existing mechanisms. So, the measurement of those is already ongoing. Others we don't capture currently, and that's the challenge for us, is to work out how we put those monitoring and reporting mechanisms in place. So that's part of our next challenge from this point going forward. And it's not a small one. No, it's not a small challenge.
And do you see that you'll have people inside your organisation, which is this is their day job, this is their 100% focused job around sustainability and the like?
Not currently, no. I mean, for us as an organisation, we don't have the capacity to create that sort of specific role. So for us, it will be spread across a number of roles. And really, it would be at the executive level that those outcomes are brought together and reported through to board. Board's very clear that it expects regular reporting on our actions, and that's based on the strategy that they are required to sign off on. Of course, they want feedback, and they want accurate feedback. So we're just negotiating that space at the moment.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Dave, I just wonder if we could maybe even just look at kind of Australia's progress as an organisation, as a country in regards to the SDGs and their progress reporting to the UN. What's your sense for how Australia is going?
It's actually a mixed picture. On the health and education, doing quite well. Some clear progress there against the SDGs. On issues of equality and poverty, doing not so well. On climate change, doing particularly badly. So it's very much the mixed bag. If you do look at the overall ratings at national level, I think Australia currently sits at 38, somewhere between Latvia and Belarus, I think it might be, or Ukraine maybe. Which is, we're not up there with Finland and Sweden. I think UK is about 7th. So we're lagging is the essential conclusion. I think we're not doing as well as we should be.
Yeah. And who sits number 1, Dave?
I think, from memory, Finland.
Finland. And what are they doing that's transferable to Australia?
Oh, well, major investment in renewable energies. I think something like 30-odd% of new cars are electrical vehicles. A massive change to their grid system, but also social reforms, particularly around housing. About 31% of their housing is social housing. Major program on homelessness based on housing first principles. A very progressive, enlightened nation. I'd like to think that we could all model ourselves at least partially on some of the the kind of policies and concepts that drive them. Closer to home, we've got well-being budgeting in New Zealand, which I think is another good example of what can be done. So lots of good practice to follow.
Yeah, and just building on that, Dave, of course, it's across the jurisdictions, as you mentioned before, Dave. I mean, business is in a lot of ways leading well ahead of government, and in some cases making government pretty redundant in this whole process. But also at the state and territory level, there's a lot of progress going on. So whilst there are huge challenges, and Australia as a whole can be very depressing, looking at how, our Prime Minister performs overseas, etc., and the lack of commitment at the national level. At the state and territory level, there's a lot going on. And, South Australia, for instance, was only a couple of weeks ago that we had some hours during the week where 100% of the state's power was from renewable sources. And there are initiatives that we can link to at that level that we should be keeping an eye on. There's some very positive opportunity out there. I mean, South Australia, again, for instance, the commitment in South Australia to creating virtual power plants by getting solar onto housing and creating battery backup. And there's a program that we're engaging with here, which is getting that onto social housing. So at no cost. To us. I mean, there are various strategic issues there in terms of tying up assets and making long-term commitments and so forth that you have to work your way through. But there are some really exciting opportunities coming through at that level for us all to engage with. And so I think it's in the general, it's a fairly gloomy picture, but at the local level, there are a lot of opportunities to engage in really positive activities.
And I think it's worth underlining that as well, Matthew, but that's not a political party thing either, because South Australia and New South Wales, which are very much at the front of this, are both Liberal administrations. So in that sense, there is a lot of positive action.
And you see South Australia, New South Wales and the ACT have recently formed a coalition to actually, drive activities in this space. So it is, there's some really positive bits and pieces.
Yeah, fantastic. We've got a couple of questions on the chat, and then we've got Sharon got her hand up. But we'll go to you in a bit, Sharon. But let me just go to Peter Clayfield's question. Who does it, or how does an organisation, I think Peter's after, measure their carbon footprint to get a baseline of where they are moving from? Dave, might be similar to Alice's question earlier. It might be how long's a piece of string, but where would you suggest?
There's a huge number of online resources, including self-measurement resources out there, and methodologies for doing that. Almost, pick from a very large bunch of opportunities, and of course there are organizations that deliver bespoke carbon measurement, and of course the value of that is independent verification, so that you're not measuring yourself and claiming yourself, you are actually being audited by an external recognized body. Quick drop into a search engine, you'll be drowning in information very quickly.
Right. So there's plenty of resources online.
Yep.
Excellent. We'll go to you, Sharon. We'll get you to ask your question. Then John Eastgate, we'll go to your question. So Sharon, please unmute your microphone there and fire away.
Yeah, look, I just wondered, it was just the discussion that's happening earlier about the opportunities to get involved and what South Australia is doing. I mean, I know South Australia, and through the university there, have done a lot of work in the renewables area and in precincts and that sort of thing, and understanding how solar works and the battery, what sort of batteries you need, and trying to get a sort of system right. Are you referring to New South Wales and South Australia in the sense of is it being driven by the universities, the researchers, when you were talking about these opportunities, or is it more the government and private enterprise? Just curious, that's all. Does that make sense?
I was certainly talking about the government policy, and the critical thing here, I think, is government setting a policy framework that then allows for example, private sector organisations to have some certainty about investment and forward planning. So universities all have sustainability centres and various projects. I've worked with one in Newcastle. So universities are always good links to establish, I think, particularly on not just the research front, but on the practice front as well.
Yes, that's right. Yeah,
they often have guides and good resources that you can tap into. But I was certainly talking more about at the government level, I think. Yeah.
Okay. And Matthew, you were saying about these opportunities. I just was curious, is that coming from becoming involved in a project or getting private funding or government funding?
No, they're really, I mean, as Dave said, they've come out of government policy around the support for the policy settings around renewable energy. And there's been quite a history here in South Australia of, building towards consistent and bipartisan. So it's, it's got up ahead of steam. And there's been investment, Zen and various other providers are partnering with government around the rollout and delivery. Tesla's involved, of course, the big battery that we had put in up north, and they're also involved in this virtual power plant arrangements. So it's government policy and strategy, and often private sector partners that you're engaging with. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Sharon. Thanks for those questions. Let me just go to John Eastgate, who's up in Queensland. So it should be the biggest virtual solar farm in the country one day up in Queensland. Who knows? But John's question is, I'm wondering how easy or hard you found it to work out how to tackle these issues, and particularly the climate-related bits. So this one's a good one for you, Matthew, I think. Now, he's got an ulterior motive, so he's declared his interest there. He's got a project that he's been working on up there in Queensland. What's your thoughts there, Matthew?
Look, I mean, it's easy and it's hard in the sense that, aspirationally, it's not hard to engage with. I mean, as I say, it's been a journey for our organisation, for me personally, and I know it has at Compass as well. There are some of the difficulties around resource constraints to be able to, progress beyond a level of concern and participation in, forums and mechanisms to debate this and support it verbally. To move that towards actually concrete action is the difficult bit, because that's a resource. And also you need a plan, you need a structure to be able to do that. And that's been what's taken a bit longer. And that's again where it's been useful from Unity's perspective to be able to engage with Compass and the work it's doing, in that that's given us a structure to actually work with, and some leadership, some guidance in terms of how we might structure our own organisation. We've had to do with the internal bits ourselves. And that's really been bringing together the issues at a governance level, at a business level in terms of our capacity, our budgets, our finances, and the way that we're directing ourselves. That's been, I don't think there's a quick way of doing that. I think it's got to be a process. You've got to work your way through it. But it doesn't have to be a never-ending process either. It can be a finite process, and that's where Dave's been invaluable to us in helping us structure the steps and the timeframes for us to actually work through this in a practical way.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Matthew. Dave, just a question to you. I'm reluctant to ask a political question, but I'm going to, and it won't involve a submarine or a text message. But let me ask you this. If the Australian Prime Minister goes to Glasgow and has a far more ambitious goal for Australia, and he sets a charter that's very different to the real one, who screams the loudest back here in Australia? Who's the one group who says it's not going to happen? Who's the handbrake in this conversation, do you think?
Well, we traditionally identify some groups like the farmers, for example. The reality is, of course, that they're embracing climate change. And they're embracing the opportunities it brings for them. Campus recently organised an Urban Thinkers Campus for the World Urban Campaign, and we looked at transition to a low carbon economy. And we had representative from something called the Jobs Alliance for Newcastle. And this consists of 8 unions, all of them arguing for transition planning. So, you know, we tend to think of certain blockages that aren't actually there. In reality, they are already moving and recognizing the future. Obviously, there are vested interests. Coal is the one that's probably most difficult because, you know, when I speak to someone who come from South Wales where the coal industry disappeared overnight.
Yeah.
And the devastating consequences for those communities. So there has to be what is usually referred to as a just transition, one that protects livelihoods, protects communities. But if you plan it and you do that transition well, it creates economic opportunity. And you know, someone did point out this week that the government has let 40,000 jobs disappear in the university sector during the COVID crisis without a murmur, and yet protects what some argue is less direct jobs in the mining industry. So, you know, these are very difficult questions, and no one would advocate that you just end an industry. You know, there has to be a process of just transition and very careful planning to protect those employment opportunities and the communities that depend on them.
Yeah, and interesting you mentioned farming, Dave, because that's where I would have gone to. So what you're saying is that they're far more accepting of the change. Is that traditional plant-based farming, or is that animal agriculture who's changing, or is it both?
I think it's across the board. And don't forget, the farming community also bears the brunt of drought.
Yeah.
And, you know, is very much at the forefront of climate change. You know, you have some crops that were once viable in parts of Australia that are no longer viable. And, you know, livelihoods disappear with that. We have the crisis of the Murray-Darling Basin and the water distribution. You know, these are very live and real concerns for the farming community. And they're responding by a growing movement of what's usually referred to as regenerative farming, improving soil health, improving carbon sequestration in soil. There are huge opportunities for the farming community, and you know, their peak bodies are now recognizing this, and in many ways are ahead of government.
Yeah. Now, last question before we wrap up, and if anyone's got any last questions they would like to pose, please put them into the chat. Now, you said I forget the words you used specifically, Dave, but you said you're an optimist. So are you?
This is my beer mat. It's probably in reverse to you, but it says relentless optimism.
Yeah, no, I like that. I like that. So you hold a real optimistic outlook for the future, particularly 2030.
I cannot believe that the human race wants to effectively commit suicide as a mass. You know, I think there is growing pressure for change. It's coming from all sectors of society, and eventually it must have an impact on the actions of government and the actions of, you know, the few organizations that are driving the expansion and use of fossil fuels. Eventually they will lose their consumer base as a result. Yeah.
And I think the other thing to carry in mind with that is, I mean, I'd confess to being, I mean, I'm accused by my family of being a bit of a prepper, quite frankly, but I try to stay optimistic. But I think, you know, the key to it is just to talk, as you described, you know, the communities that are going to be hit, Dave, is one of the important things is to realise the inevitability of the change that is coming. You know, that Australia doesn't stand apart from the rest of the world, that there will be massive changes, there will be climate change, and there will be requirements to actually change some of the industrial base that we work with, coal, and some of the associated activities. You know, and I worked in my early years as a social worker in what used to be called the Iron Triangle, effectively, you know, in South Australia, the industrial mid-north. And I was recently in Gladstone, and you know, look at those communities, and I think without the transitional planning, you are going to have the sort of social catastrophe that you talked about in the valleys in Wales, David. And those are our people. That's where we work. So, you know, I think we just need to carry that in mind, that change is coming. It's not going to be well planned. We may or may not survive as a species, but along the way, it's our people who are going to wear the brunt of this one way or the other. And so we need to be thinking about that in terms of, you know, I guess our services and where we might be required. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Matthew. Now we do have one last question. John Eastgate up in Queensland. He just got in by the skin of his teeth. So we've got 5 minutes. So John, please pose your question.
It's just more of a comment. I was thinking about the question that was posed about optimism and pessimism, and I heard something recently about it. When you frame it as optimism and pessimism, what's behind that is that we're passive. We are looking and trying to predict what's going to happen. And the person who I was listening to contrasted that with hope and despair. And when you're filled with hope, you take action. And when you're despairing, you give up. And the point for me has always been, it looks bad, but we can't give in to despair, and we have to keep hoping, and the hope makes us act. And that's what drives us to keep going forwards, because the future is not individually, obviously there's billions of people on the planet, but collectively the future is in our hands. It's not something that's going to happen to us.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that, John. That's absolutely spot on. Spot on. Thank you for that. Dave, Matthew, last reflections before we close off today's panel.
I'd like to, I suppose, call on all organisations that will be able to look back in 20 years' time and say we did something, not that we sat on our hands and waited. And really encourage everyone online to foster that belief in their organisation.
Yeah, thank you, Dave.
And I mean, I endorse what you just said, John. Drag myself towards optimism as hard as I can, and you're absolutely right. That's what does drive actually proactive activity on our part. But I guess just reflect on, there was a comment made in the chat earlier on about working on this cooperatively and together, and we've certainly benefited so much from the work that Compass has done. And so I just speak to, as a sector, I think a collective approach to this is really important, and will make, possible, what you can do collectively is much greater than you can do individually. Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, I'm going to call our panel conversation to a close. So all good meetings end early, as I understand it. So I want to thank both you, Dave and Matthew, for just, first of all, your time, but also for just sharing your experience. I think it's a topic that we all have a genuine interest in, and something that we all want to possibly be, both individually and collectively in our organisations, better at. So on behalf of everyone in today's audience, can I just thank the both of you for your time today and giving it up on this important topic. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.
No, it's brilliant. Can I just say to everyone, thanks for the audience as well for being here today. We'll get a copy of the recording out to you very, very shortly, so you can re-watch that. And again, thank you for your time here with the AHI today, and we look forward to seeing you when we next meet. The AHI Awards are coming up in December, virtual awards, and in some locations we're doing some things in person as well, where we're allowed to. So we look forward to seeing some of you there at those maybe. So thanks again, everyone. Thanks for your time today. All the best.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.